The last video, we left off with an impossible situation. The aesthetic life leaves you empty, but the ethical life leaves you stale. But you still have to choose how to live, and you have to make that choice before you have enough information to make it well. So, what do you do? Well, Kierkegaard said that there is a third option, something beyond the pleasure seeking and duty following. But to understand it, we need to look at what happens when somebody actually makes a commitment without being able to rationally justify it. Later in 1843, the same year as Either Or, Kierkegaard published another book called Fear and Trembling, and in it, he goes back to one of the oldest stories in Western culture, the story of Isaac and Abraham. Now, I'm not just bringing this up to make a religious argument. I'm bringing it up because Kierkegaard uses this story to illustrate something philosophical about the nature of commitment and choice, and what it means to act when you don't have rational justification. Now, Abraham is promised by God that he will have a son named Isaac, and through Isaac, he'll become the father of many nations. And this problem seems absurd because in the story, Abraham is already 99. His wife, Sarah, is 90. So having a child is biologically implausible. But Abraham believes it anyway, and the time passes. It becomes even more unreasonable with each year. And eventually, miraculously, Isaac is born, with a little bit of drama in between. Now, Abraham finally has everything he wanted. But then God tells Abraham to off Isaac, to take him up to a mountain and sacrifice him. Now, forget the religious framing for a moment and think about this as a philosophical problem about choice and commitment. Abraham is being asked to do something that contradicts everything that he has heard previously. It contradicts the promises that he was given and the basic moral intuitions about not harming other people. It contradicts rational self-interest, since Isaac is his only legitimate heir. And it especially contradicts with his emotional bonds as a father. If Abraham sits down and tries to reason this through, there is no way to make it work. The pieces don't fit because it's logically incoherent. God promised that Isaac would father nations, but now wants him gone before he can even have children, which is in and of itself a contradiction. So, what does a rational person do when faced with a command that makes no logical sense? They reject it. They say that this cannot be right because it violates basic principles of consistency and logic and morality. But Abraham doesn't do that. He gets up the next morning and heads to the mountain. He is going to actually go through with it. He is committed to this course of action, even though he can't justify it. And Kierkegaard says that this is the key to understanding the third way. This is what he calls the leap of faith. Now, it's not necessarily faith in a specific religion, but faith as a philosophical category and as a mode of existence that goes beyond what reason can support. Think about what's happening here philosophically. Abraham is making a commitment without rational justification. He's choosing a course of action that seems absurd. He's betting everything on something that he cannot prove or verify or even logically defend. And this is completely different from both the aesthetic life and the ethical one. The aesthetic person makes choices based on what will bring pleasure or satisfaction. The ethical person makes choices based on universal moral principles that can be rationally defended. But the person of faith makes a commitment that transcends both pleasure seeking and rational principle following. Kierkegaard describes this as using paradoxes. Abraham's strength is his weakness. His wisdom is foolishness. His hope looks like madness. They are describing a genuine philosophical paradox. Abraham is doing something that, by all rational standards, looks like weakness, foolishness, and madness. But Kierkegaard says that this is actually a higher form of strength and wisdom because it represents absolute commitment, not commitment that is contingent on whether or not it makes sense, or even commitment based on calculating outcomes. Just commitment, pure and faithful. And this is what was missing from both options in either or. The ascetic life never commits to anything beyond the momentary pleasures, and the ethical life commits only to what can be universally rationalized. But genuine commitment, the kind that actually defines who you are, requires going beyond both. You have to choose without being certain that you're right. You have to commit without being able to prove that it's the best option, and to leap without knowing where you're going to land. And yeah, it's terrifying. Kierkegaard calls it fear and trembling, because you are abandoning all safety nets and can't fall back on rational justification. You can't just say, well, I calculated the possibilities, and this was the most logical choice. Because you're exposed and vulnerable and acting without the normal supports. But this is also what makes the commitment real. When you can rationally justify something, you're not really choosing it. You're just following where the logic leads. When you can prove that something is the right decision, there is no leap. You're just taking the obviously correct path. But real choice only happens when you have to commit without certainty. When you have to decide that knowing you might be wrong, and to take responsibility for something that you can't fully rationalize. Now, this connects to another distinction that Kierkegaard makes: the difference between objective and subjective truth. Objective truth is what can be verified externally, like proven through logic or evidence, what everyone can agree on regardless of their personal perspective. But subjective truth is what is true for you in terms of how you exist, what you're willing to stake your life on, and what you commit to so deeply that it defines who you are. The aesthetic and ethical lives both try to operate purely at the level of objective truth. The aesthetic person tries to objectively determine what will bring them the most pleasure, and the ethical person tries to objectively determine what moral principles are universally correct. But subjective truth requires something else entirely: making a commitment that goes beyond what can be objectively verified, and choosing yourself into existence in a way that isn't exactly following external standards. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine that you are trying to decide whether to commit to a relationship. You could approach it objectively, make a list of pros and cons, and calculate compatibility scores. And at the end of the process, you might have good reasons to think that this relationship could work. But that is not the same thing as commitment. Commitment means that you are willing to be with this person, even if the calculations don't work out perfectly, even if you cannot prove that it's the optimal choice. The commitment is precisely the part that goes beyond rational calculation, the part that makes it real and yours, and an authentic choice, rather than just following a self-inflicted algorithm. Kierkegaard is saying that this is true for your whole life, not just your relationships, but how you live, what you value, and who you become, require a leap beyond what you can reasonably support. And this is why he describes Abraham as believing the preposterous. Not because religious belief is necessarily irrational, but because any genuine commitment will involve believing in something that you cannot fully prove. Because commitment to something that might be wrong is taking a leap without knowing where you'll land, and you can't avoid it. You might think that you can stay at the level of objectivity. Just follow the rational principles and calculate the best outcomes and let logic be your guide. But that's not actually possible when it comes to the fundamental question of how to live. Because there is no objectively correct answer to how you should live your life. There are different frameworks, different values, and different possibilities. And choosing between them requires going beyond what can be objectively determined. Now, you can try to avoid the leap and try to stay safe by never fully committing to anything. But that, in and of itself, is a choice. And it's probably the worst choice because you'll end up never really living. You're just drifting through possibilities without ever taking responsibility for defining yourself. So, the third way, the life of faith in Kierkegaard's sense, is not about religion. It's about being willing to make genuine commitments, to choose without complete certainty, and to take responsibility for defining yourself through actions that go beyond rational calculation. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be irrational or make decisions based on absolutely nothing or believe in things that are clearly not true. It just means that you have to recognize that reason alone cannot answer fundamental questions about how to exist. At some point, you have to leap. You have to commit and choose yourself into being. And when you do, you'll experience fear and trembling because you're acting without proof. You're taking responsibility without being able to definitively justify yourself. But you're also, for the first time, living, making choices and committing authentically, defining who you are through actions that are genuinely yours, rather than just following external standards. But if this is true, if genuine commitment requires a leap beyond reason, then we have to confront some uncomfortable questions about anxiety and dread and responsibility, about what it means to be free, and about how you live when you know that you're choosing without certainty. That is what we need to address next. And we will in the next video. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.